Outfitting your party with the best equipment available is one of the purest joys there is in any role-playing game. There's just something so satisfying about saving up for that new sword or finding a powerful staff hidden away in a dungeon and then getting to actually use it in combat. In Final Fantasy, the most fulfilling version of this experience comes in the form of ultimate weapons. Though each game has had its own take on the concept, these weapons are each legendary in their own right, often powerful beyond the means of regular weapons found in shops, and actually obtaining them is often seen as a badge of honour amongst players, because as the franchise has developed, they have often been some of the hardest rewards earned for overcoming extreme adversity. That being said, sometimes these ultimate weapons weren't really as useful as they first seemed, and we're going to focus on those ultimate weapons in this video. The ones that underwhelmed to the point of being nearly completely useless, because even though they were strong, there were still better options available, or there was just no real point in going through the effort involved in their acquisition in the first place. So with the usual caveat that we're going to focus on only one weapon per game, here's 7 ultimate weapons that were almost completely useless. Final Fantasy XII featured a ton of great weapons, and the roster was enhanced even further following the release of the International Zodiac Job System and then the Zodiac Age. But one of the so-called ultimate weapons always stands out. Included as an homage to Dragon Quest Erdrick, the Wyrmhero blade was a great sword that boasted impressively high attack stats and combo rates. And alongside being imbued with the holy element, the Wyrmhero blade also passively boosted its wielder's faith and bravery. It also didn't require a license to equip, meaning it could be used by any character and any build. This all should have made it one of the best weapons in the game, but unfortunately the Wyrmhero blade was held back by a couple of key points. First, and most noticeably, it was painfully slow to use, to the point of being one of the slowest weapons in the game. This slowness could be mitigated to a point by the use of haste or berserk, but even that was still a significant drawback for the weapon, leaving it well behind other first-generation legendary weapons like the Zodiac Spear. The second issue was the method of acquisition. In the original version of the game, the Wyrmhero blade was obtained by trading items in guild for the Dragon Quest through the Bazaar system, and the items it required were some of the hardest in the game to obtain, as they were spoils from beating the hardest super bosses. Specifically, these items were Liu Shang's badge from the Den of the Riverlord section of the fishing minigame, the Godslayer's badge from defeating Yismat, and the Omega badge, which was dropped after defeating Omega Mark 12. Once all these items were assembled, the Wyrmhero blade could then be claimed for the price of 65,535 gil. Because of all these aspects, in the original version, there was very little use for the Wyrmhero blade once it was obtained, as the majority of the game's strongest challenges had already been overcome. This then changed in the International Zodiac Job System version. Here, the Wyrmhero blade was given something of a new lease of life, as it was now obtainable through the game's trial mode on stage 50 as a rare steal from Famfrit. This meant the Wyrmhero blade could be used earlier in the game, and additionally benefited from having its damage cap removed, allowing it to deal well beyond 9,999 damage, something that finally turned it into one of the best ultimate weapons in the game, as opposed to being one that was rather useless. In Final Fantasy X, each character had purposeful ultimate weapons known as the Celestial Weapons, and the quest to obtain them had become notorious amongst the community due to how time-consuming and painful they can be. This was because it not only involved obtaining the Celestial Mirror, which related to a side quest at Remium Temple and then Macalania Temple, but also obtaining the weapons and upgrading them by finding the associated crests and sigils. Some of these steps were quite simple, as the God Hand and Masamune, for example, just needed to be found, but each weapon introduced at least one cumbersome aspect. So whereas the God Hand was easy to find, assuming you knew the password to unlock the secret location on the airship, the continued quest involved hunting down cactuars in the Cenubia Desert. Amongst the various tasks available though, none filled players with dread more than attempting to maximise the strength of Lulu's ultimate weapon, Onion Knight. To obtain the basic weapon, players simply needed to return to Barge and defeat Gasgano, something which unlocked a nearby treasure chest. The Venus Crest was also easy enough to obtain, as players needed to trek back to the far plane where it could just be picked up. But the Venus Sigil was a whole other story. To obtain this, players needed to head to the Thunder Plains and dodge 200 lightning bolts in a row without being struck. And although some exploits have since been found to make the task a little bit easier, it still serves as a severe test of Twitch reactions, and also patience. Upon doing so, Onion Knight was upgraded, and this allowed Lulu to break the damage limit and passively ignore defense, but it also offered up triple overdrive, magic booster, and 1 MP cost. On paper, these all seemed like great additions, but because Lulu's overdrive was the hardest to maximize in terms of damage output in the game, she's often the least used character, so making her celestial weapon arguably the most difficult to obtain was tough to swallow for many. Whereas Final Fantasy VI's characters all shared a weapon pool, with each character being able to equip a variety of weapons in addition to the occasional bespoke pieces, Final Fantasy VII's weapons were all character specific, and this meant it was the first game where each character had their own unique ultimate weapon, every character, including Aerith. Amongst the endgame cast, each ultimate weapon had power that scaled against a variety of factors, such as a character's HP, MP, or current limit gauge. And this meant getting the full damage potential out of the weapons often required optimal conditions and knowledge of the mechanics. This then made Aerith's ultimate weapon, the Princess Guard, quite interesting, as it too featured specific conditions to maximize damage output, but they weren't related to Aerith. It was instead related to the party status. This meant the more characters were downed in the party, the stronger the Princess Guard got. If just one party member was down, its power doubled, and if two were down, it tripled. Such enhancements were quite crazy, but as Aerith wasn't really positioned as a powerhouse physical fighter, it wasn't all that useful, as in most situations, Aerith would be better off attempting to revive the fallen party members to even the odds, as opposed to trying to win the day herself with her enhanced physical attacks. The other factor was that the Princess Guard was obtained in the Temple of the Ancients near the end of Disc 1, so Aerith got very little time to actually make use of it. This put the Princess Guard in a bit of a weird spot, as when it was acquired it was extremely powerful and clearly Aerith's best weapon, but due to its extremely limited use case and the fact that it had little to no late game value, it had very little actual practical application, meaning that even if it was missed outright, it didn't really matter, as there were no real scenarios outside of a 100% completion run or one where physical stats had been min-maxed to the extreme on Aerith, where the Princess Guard was necessary at all. Coming out a year after the release of Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII did a lot to turn what worked in previous entries in the series on its head, but it's most notable for replacing most of the series' long-held and finely tuned progression mechanics in favour of the junction system. The system gave players near-complete freedom over how to build their characters, limited only by their inventory of magic spells, but it also removed the need for all equipment as a result, save paradoxically for weapons. In Final Fantasy VIII, instead of buying weapons, they were instead upgradable via junk shops that, when the correct materials were obtained, could transform each character's weapon into a better form. These newer forms all boasted better stats, but the stat increases were moot, as a lot more function in this regard could be delivered by proper optimization with the junction system. Squall stood out in this regard, as acquiring Lionheart was the only way to obtain his ultimate limit break, but other characters did not have the same benefit, which created a real dilemma in terms of reward versus time expenditure. Amongst this group, Zell's Ehrgeiz often has the biggest quandary relating to it, as it was the worst amongst the selection of ultimate weapons in terms of collective raw power, but it was also one of the hardest to obtain. It offered a boost of 25 to the strength stat, which was tied with Quistis' Save the Queen, Selphie's Strange Vision, and Irvine's Exeter. But what set Zell's ultimate weapon apart was that it had the awkward and dubious honour of sporting the worst hit rate of 103. Not only that, its stats were only marginally better than Zell's second best weapon, Gauntlet, which had 20 strength and hit rate of 101. Considering Zell was capable of dealing massive amounts of damage just fine on his own through his limit break or through junctioning the right spells to his strength stat organically, it meant that collecting the Adamantine, Dragon Skin and Fury Fragment necessary to craft the weapon wasn't really worth the effort in comparison to the other ultimate weapons available in the game. Final Fantasy V featured a multitude of powerful weapons, from the Ragnarok through to the sealed weapons. But there are also two hidden weapons called the Chicken Knife and the Brave Blade that were more than comparable, except their functions were opposed to each other. Both could be found in the town of Moor in the merged world after following a secret network of passages and then speaking to an old man. You then had to choose to be a coward, thus receiving the Chicken Knife, or not, which granted the Brave Blade. Initially, choosing the Brave Blade seemed like a wise choice, as it had a raw attack power of 150, which was higher even than the Ragnarok. But it came with a very specific caveat. Its attack power decreased every single time the party ran from an encounter, and this output was based on every retreat across the entire game, not just those that happened after acquiring the Brave Blade. It was also restricted to only being wielded by knights and freelancers, and after learning how much more powerful and versatile the chicken knife could be, it rendered the Brave Blade almost completely useless by comparison. When discussing ultimate weapons in relation to specific characters, it's easy to assume that they should be the character's best and most reliable choice when it comes to dealing massive damage and receiving other benefits. And when it came to most of the ultimate weapons in Final Fantasy IX, that notion was certainly true. Vivi's Mace of Zeus, for example, was not only a powerful staff, but it could also teach Vivi the spell Doomsday, and Steiner's Excalibur II was in a class of its own. At first glance, Queena's ultimate weapon, the Gastrofork, seemed comparable to its peers. It had the highest attack power for that character and could even inflict the stop status on enemies. But that was before taking into consideration how Queena's fork weapons actually functioned. At the start, forks essentially dealt random damage, which meant that the Gastrofork's high attack stat was useful in determining maximum damage, but was not indicative of the average damage dealt. What's more, while the chance of inflicting stop was certainly useful, the Gastrofork itself didn't offer Quina any opportunities to learn abilities, as it shared the sole learnable support ability with all other fork weapons, which was High Tide, and this was due to the fact that Quina's blue magic skill set was instead acquired through the E command. To top it all off, getting the Gastrofork itself was an involved quest, as it required clearing the frog-catching minigame side quest, which included also besting Quail from Q's Marsh in combat. And although Quail wasn't quite on the same level as Ozma and Hades, they were still classified as a super boss due to them having the most HP of any enemy in the game, and delivering high damage through strong water abilities and physical attacks. It meant, compared to the other quests or ultimate weapons, the payoff for the Gastrofork just wasn't anywhere near as strong. That then brings us on to Final Fantasy XV, a game that featured a ton of powerful weapons of varying classifications. Some of them, like the Balmong, were simply found in dungeons as a reward for navigating the perilous hazards found within, while others related to the Royal Arms quest that began right at the start of the game. These weapons were designed as powerful relics from the past, able to grant strong stat boost, while also featuring great raw stats as well. This made them akin to the likes of the sealed weapons from Final Fantasy V, as they catered for all different kinds of playstyles. The downside was that when used, Noctis's health drained, and they could not be used to exploit any weaknesses amongst enemies. Still, due to how powerful they were, the trade-off was sometimes worth it. And amongst the group, the Sword of the Tool, which was a greatsword, offered the highest raw attack power at a whopping 518, with only a handful of other weapons in the game offering higher stats, and most of those in terms of the greatsword category were locked to Chapter 15. To obtain the Sword of the Tool, players simply had to find it in Costlemark Tower, a challenging dungeon, and on paper it was a worthwhile acquisition due to that raw power and the fact it granted Noctis an extra 200 HP. But the downside was that the Sword of the Tool was incredibly slow, and it decreased all of Noctis's major elemental resistances by 40%. Meaning its damage dealing potential was dire in comparison to many other weapons, while making Noctis even more vulnerable to taking damage and having that damage received then boosted. It meant that there was seldom a situation where the Sword of the Tool, despite its incredible attack power, was recommended for use, making it a pretty strong candidate for this discussion. But with that, they were 7 ultimate weapons that were almost completely useless. Be sure to let us know in the comments below which you found to be the least useful, and if you enjoyed this video, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Frederick Forrest and Stephen, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.